In the quiet farming town of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, surrounded by open fields and muddy roads, there once stood a pig farm that seemed ordinary, maybe even harmless. A place where the scent of manure hung in the air and the sound of squealing pigs echoed across the acres. But beyond the fences and the rusted gates, something dark was growing, something that would one day shock the entire nation. That place was the Pickton pig farm. And at the center of it all was one man, Robert William Pickton. A man whose name would soon become synonymous with horror. Robert, known to many as Willie, was born in 1949, the second of 3 children in a poor, isolated family. From the outside, their pig farm looked like a normal working property, but inside the farmhouse, life was far from normal. His parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were known throughout the town as strange, antisocial, and cruel. Louise, in particular, was described as dominating and cold, obsessed with the pigs more than her own children. The Pickton kids rarely bathed, rarely went to school, and when they did, they were often bullied for smelling like pigs. Teachers described them as withdrawn and unkempt. Robert, shy and soft-spoken, was said to spend most of his time with the animals, cleaning pens, feeding pigs, and working long hours from dawn till dark. He never learned the basic skills of social life. Instead, he grew up isolated, misunderstood, and emotionally stunted. One event from his childhood stands out in local lore. When Robert was a boy, his family owned a calf that he adored. He fed it, talked to it, treated it like a friend. But one day, when he came home from school, the calf was gone. His mother had butchered it for meat. For Robert, that moment reportedly broke something inside him. From that day on, his sense of empathy began to fade. The line between life and death, between animal and human, started to blur. As the years passed, the Pickton children inherited the family land. Robert and his brother David continued running the pig farm after their parents died, while their sister Linda moved away, wanting nothing to do with the place. The property was massive, over 17 acres of mud, machinery, and decay. The pigs roamed freely, garbage piled up, and the entire farm carried a smell that could make visitors gag. Locals described Robert as a dirty man, someone who always looked like he hadn't washed in days. He wore old, greasy clothes and carried himself with a strange nervousness. Despite his awkwardness, he had a reputation for being kind to drifters and addicts, often offering them food or money for small jobs on the farm. But that kindness had a darker purpose. It was a way to lure people in, to make them trust him. Robert's world revolved around the farm, but he wanted more. Together with his brother, he founded a non-profit organization called the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. The name sounded innocent enough, but its purpose was far from charitable. The brothers converted an old slaughterhouse on their property into a party hall, a place where wild, all-night raves were held for bikers, truckers, drug dealers, and anyone looking for trouble. Loud music, alcohol, and chaos filled the nights. Sometimes, hundreds of people would show up. Among those who attended were sex workers from Vancouver's downtown east side, one of the poorest and most vulnerable neighborhoods in the country. Many of these women were battling addiction and poverty, living on society's edge, easy targets for someone like Pickton. He blended in quietly, a strange but familiar face, never raising suspicion. He'd talk softly, offer them a ride, promise a meal or some money, and many went with him, never to return. Despite his odd behavior, most people in town never thought Robert was dangerous. They saw him as a lonely, simple-minded farmer, maybe a bit off, but harmless. He'd show up at local stores smelling of pigs, mumble his words, and wander off in his old, rusted truck. Neighbors noticed strange things sometimes: screams in the night, women walking up to the property who were never seen again, the constant burning of garbage and animal remains, but no one said anything. Some who worked for him described bizarre scenes: piles of rotting meat, blood-stained tools, and bags filled with things that didn't always look like pig parts. But because it was a pig farm, people didn't question it. No one wanted to believe what their gut told them, that something horrifying was happening right under their noses. Over time, the farm became more than just a business. It became Robert Pickton's personal kingdom, a place where he had complete control. There were no rules, no witnesses, and no one to stop him. He lived in filth, surrounded by pigs and decay, but for him, that chaos was comfort. He knew every inch of that land, where to hide things, where to burn them, and where no one would ever look. What made Robert Pickton truly terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how easily he fooled everyone. He wasn't the type of serial killer you'd expect. He wasn't charismatic or cunning in the traditional sense. He was awkward, quiet, almost invisible. And that invisibility gave him power. Behind his muddy clothes and slow speech was a man who harbored a growing hunger for control and cruelty. Those who got close enough to sense something wrong often brushed it off as his weirdness. Even when the police received anonymous tips linking him to missing women, they didn't act. After all, who would suspect a pig farmer living in filth could be capable of mass murder? But Robert Pickton wasn't just capable, he was methodical. His isolated farm became a trap, a place where victims vanished without a trace. The sound of squealing pigs and the stench of blood masked every crime. While the world slept peacefully, Pickton was turning his farm into a slaughterhouse unlike any other, one that would eventually make him one of Canada's most prolific serial killers. For over a decade, the truth remained buried under the dirt and filth of that farm. No one dared to look closer. The parties continued, the women kept disappearing, and Robert went about his days as if nothing was wrong. But the clock was ticking. Soon, a small mistake, one that seemed trivial at the time, would blow the lid off everything. The pig farm, once a quiet corner of the countryside, would soon become the largest crime scene in Canadian history. And the world would finally learn what kind of monster had been hiding in plain sight. He wasn't a movie villain. He wasn't a genius killer. He was a man who lived among pigs, and treated people the same way. The story of Robert Pickton wasn't just about murder, it was about how evil can hide behind ordinary faces, and how silence can let monsters grow. While Robert Pickton lived quietly on his pig farm, miles away in the heart of Vancouver, something deeply disturbing was unfolding. It was the 1990s, and in the shadows of the city, women were disappearing, one after another, vanishing as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Most of these women came from Vancouver's downtown east side, a place often described as Canada's poorest postal code, a neighborhood struggling with addiction, homelessness, and violence. For decades, it had been forgotten by most of society, a place where people went when they had nowhere else left to go. The women who vanished weren't celebrities or politicians. They weren't the kind of people the news usually talked about. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters, each with their own story, stories filled with pain, survival, and hope. Many of them were sex workers, some battled drug addiction, and others were simply trying to get by day to day. But in the eyes of many, they were invisible. Between 1978 and 2001, more than 60 women disappeared from the downtown east side. Their families filed reports, desperate for answers. Posters with faces and names began covering light poles and walls. Missing, have you seen her? But those posters faded in the rain while the disappearances continued. Police brushed off many cases, assuming the women had moved away, overdosed, or simply walked off. The truth was far more horrifying. Every few weeks, another woman went missing. They were often last seen late at night, getting into vehicles, talking to strangers, or standing near the corner of Hastings and Main, the area locals called the low track. Friends began to notice the pattern. She was just here yesterday, they'd say. She said she was going out with some guy, and then, nothing. The community knew something terrible was happening, but they couldn't prove it. There were whispers about a killer on the loose, someone targeting vulnerable women, someone who knew they wouldn't be missed right away. And somewhere, on a quiet pig farm outside the city, Robert Pickton was watching. He knew this area well. He drove his old pickup truck through those streets regularly, offering women rides to come help on the farm, or promising them food and money. His offers seemed innocent enough, and for women desperate for safety or cash, it felt like a lifeline. But it was a one-way trip. No one who went with him ever came back. For years, families pleaded with police to take action. Mothers stood outside precinct doors holding pictures of their missing daughters, begging for someone to listen. But most of the time, they were dismissed. Officers claimed there was no evidence of foul play. It wasn't until 1998, 2 decades after the first disappearances, that authorities finally began to notice the disturbing numbers. But even then, investigations were slow. It was easier to believe that women living such dangerous lifestyles had caused their own fates. This indifference allowed Pickton to continue his crimes, undisturbed, for years. The systemic bias and neglect towards sex workers created the perfect hunting ground for a predator like him. He knew no one would come looking, at least not right away. And that gave him all the time he needed. As the number of missing women grew, rumors began to spread through the streets of Vancouver's underworld. Some people said there was a creepy pig farmer who picked women up and they were never seen again. Others mentioned parties at the Piggy Palace where things got out of control, drugs, violence, and women who just vanished. A few people went to the police with tips pointing directly to the Pickton farm. One tip came from a former worker who claimed he saw women's clothing, jewelry, and purses scattered around the property. Another tip alleged that Pickton bragged about doing bad things to women. But every time, those reports were brushed aside: lack of evidence, lack of priority, lack of care. For a while, the community began taking matters into their own hands. Families, activists, and local volunteers created the Missing Women Task Force, demanding action. But the response was painfully slow. Each month, the list of missing women grew longer, and the pain in the community deepened. Behind every name on that list was a human being: Sarah DeVries, Mona Wilson, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papine, and many others. Each had dreams, struggles, and people who loved them. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. They trusted the wrong man. They entered his truck. They disappeared. And the police did nothing. What no one realized was that these women were all ending up in the same place: a quiet pig farm just outside Vancouver, hidden from view by mud, machinery, and a man who knew how to cover his tracks. Pickton's farm became a black hole for the vulnerable, a place where people entered and never came out. The pigs were his perfect cover. The smell, the mess, the blood, it all blended together. Even if someone screamed, no one could hear them over the sound of the animals. For over a decade, Robert Pickton hunted in plain sight. He drove into the city, picked his victims, and took them back to his farm of nightmares. Police patrols passed his truck countless times. Locals saw him at parties, markets, and bars. He was part of the background, unnoticed, unremarkable, and unseen. He was hiding in the open. And that was his greatest weapon. By the late 1990s, the number of missing women reached alarming levels. The community was desperate. Activists marched, victims' families shouted for justice, but the police still had no leads, or so they claimed. Behind closed doors, however, investigators were finally starting to piece together a possible connection. One name kept coming up again and again in witness statements and tips: Robert Pickton. But by then, it was already too late. The damage had been done. The women were gone, their remains buried beneath layers of filth and horror. In the year 2002, everything would finally come crashing down. A seemingly minor police search on Pickton's property, for something completely unrelated, would unravel the nightmare that had gone unseen for over 2 decades. But before that day came, the world had already lost too many lives, and too many families had already been broken. Vancouver had a serial killer in its midst, and no one had wanted to believe it. They were the forgotten ones, invisible to a world that never looked their way. But their disappearance would soon expose not just one man's evil, but the failures of an entire system. The story of the missing women wasn't just about tragedy, it was about how silence, ignorance, and neglect allowed a monster to thrive. And soon, that silence would be shattered forever. For years, the Pickton farm stood quietly on the outskirts of Port Coquitlam, its fences rusting, its mud thick with secrets, until a single mistake finally brought it all crashing down. It was February 2002 when police arrived at the Pickton property, not for murder, not for missing women, but for something far less sinister, an illegal firearm complaint. Officers expected a routine search, a quick inspection, and nothing more. But what they found instead would uncover one of the most horrifying crime scenes in Canadian history. As investigators began searching through the filth and clutter, they stumbled upon personal items, women's purses, IDs, jewelry, all belonging to the victims who had vanished years earlier. The deeper they dug, the darker it became. Behind barns, inside freezers, and buried beneath piles of garbage, detectives found what they at first couldn't believe were human remains. The smell of decay was overwhelming, the air heavy with death. Soon, the farm transformed into a crime scene unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It stretched over 17 acres, filled with mud, bones, and nightmares. Forensic teams moved in by the dozens, wearing hazmat suits, sifting through soil, and collecting evidence by hand. Every shovel of dirt revealed something new, a jawbone here, a fragment of skull there, and scattered across the property were countless traces of DNA belonging to multiple women. It became clear that Robert Pickton hadn't just killed, he had butchered, dismembered, and disposed of his victims in ways too gruesome to imagine. Some remains were mixed with pig meat, others possibly ground up, making it almost impossible to tell human from animal. The police realized the enormity of what they had uncovered. This wasn't a simple murder case. This was the work of a serial killer operating in plain sight for years. The investigation became the largest forensic excavation in Canadian history, taking over 2 years and costing tens of millions of dollars. Entire teams of anthropologists and forensic experts worked day and night, combing through every inch of the property, recovering thousands of pieces of evidence. They found human DNA linked to at least 33 women, but many experts believed the real number was much higher. The sheer scale of the horror stunned the nation. How could something this monstrous have happened so close to a major city without anyone noticing? The media descended on Port Coquitlam, and the world watched in disbelief as investigators described scenes of unimaginable depravity. The pig farm, once a symbol of rural hard work, was now forever branded as a graveyard of the missing. As the evidence piled up, the picture of Robert Pickton's cruelty became clearer, a man who used his pigs to hide his crimes, who turned his property into a slaughterhouse for humans, and who operated freely for decades because no one looked closely enough. The discovery at the farm didn't just reveal the bodies of the victims, it revealed the truth about society's failure to protect them, and it exposed the evil that can fester when ignorance and neglect collide. From that moment on, the Pickton farm would no longer be just a piece of land, it would become a chilling reminder of the darkness humanity is capable of hiding in plain sight. After the shocking discoveries on his farm, Robert William Pickton was finally arrested in February 2002, his calm demeanor chillingly at odds with the horror investigators were uncovering. When police first brought him in, he appeared confused, almost harmless, a quiet, scruffy pig farmer who spoke in a slow, mumbling voice. But behind that vacant stare was a man who had spent decades hiding a monstrous secret. During questioning, Pickton denied everything, claiming he was being framed, that the women who came to his farm were just friends, drifters, and drug addicts. Yet the evidence was undeniable, DNA from dozens of women found in his freezers, tools, and pig pens. Still, he showed no emotion, no remorse, not even surprise. But the true horror of his mindset emerged only after investigators placed him in a cell with an undercover police officer pretending to be another inmate. Thinking he was among friends, Pickton began to talk, and what came out of his mouth left the entire world frozen in disbelief. With eerie pride, he bragged that he had killed 49 women, and that he wanted to make it an even 50 but got sloppy and got caught. He laughed as he described how easy it had been, how no one cared about the people he chose, how he had learned to get rid of the evidence so completely that no one would ever find out. He even mentioned that he mixed human flesh with pig meat, boasting that it was the perfect way to make bodies disappear. This confession, recorded secretly, became the smoking gun prosecutors needed, a glimpse into the mind of a man completely detached from humanity. As the tape played later in court, jurors sat in stunned silence. Here was not a criminal begging for mercy, but a killer bragging about his crimes as if they were trophies. When investigators confronted him with the recording, Pickton showed no reaction, he simply looked down and said nothing. The arrogance, the lack of guilt, and the casual way he spoke of death painted a picture of pure evil hiding beneath the mask of a quiet, awkward farmer. By the time the interrogation was over, the truth was undeniable. Robert Pickton was not just a murderer, he was one of Canada's most prolific serial killers, a man who viewed human life as nothing more than livestock to be slaughtered. His words, cold and emotionless, would haunt investigators for years to come, a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, they sit calmly in front of you, smiling faintly, as they talk about murder like it's business as usual. When police finally arrested Robert Pickton in February 2002, no one could have imagined the horror that lay hidden on his pig farm. It began almost accidentally. Officers were initially investigating illegal firearm possession, not a string of murders. But once they entered his property, the gruesome discoveries began to surface. Behind the barns and trailers, investigators found blood-stained clothing, personal belongings of missing women, and even human remains mixed with animal bones. The crime scene was so vast and contaminated that it took more than a year for forensic teams to fully process the site. Over 200,000 DNA samples were collected, making it one of the largest crime investigations in Canadian history. The horror only deepened as detectives realized that Pickton had been slaughtering his victims and possibly feeding their remains to his pigs, a revelation that sent shockwaves throughout the country. When Pickton was brought to trial in 2007, he faced 27 counts of first-degree murder, though the court later focused on 6 cases to avoid overwhelming the jury. The evidence was devastating. Witnesses described Pickton bragging about killing women, claiming he wanted to make it to, and even 50. Others testified about how he lured vulnerable women, mostly sex workers from Vancouver's downtown east side, to his farm with promises of money, drugs, or a place to stay. During the trial, the jury heard chilling details about how Pickton dismembered his victims and disposed of their bodies using his pig farm equipment. His defense tried to argue that he wasn't solely responsible, suggesting others might have been involved, but the physical evidence and his own words sealed his fate. In December 2007, Robert Pickton was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty in Canada at that time. The remaining murder charges were stayed, but few doubted that his true number of victims was far higher, possibly as many as 49. After his conviction, a massive public inquiry exposed deep failures in law enforcement. Police had received multiple reports and tips about Pickton's activities years before his arrest but failed to act, largely because many of his victims were marginalized women. This revelation sparked national outrage and led to reforms in how missing persons cases are handled in Canada. Even today, the legacy of Robert Pickton's crimes haunts Vancouver. The farm was completely demolished, but for many families, the pain remains raw. There are still missing women who were never identified, and their loved ones have no closure. The pig farm murders are remembered not only as one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history but also as a grim reminder of how society's neglect of vulnerable people allowed a monster to hunt freely for years. Pickton himself remains behind bars, showing no real remorse, a silent embodiment of evil that turned a quiet Canadian farm into a place of unimaginable horror.